Hi everyone, my name is Paul Donaher and I'm Director of Client Services here at Radius Illumination. Thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar on setting you up for success with segmentation. And firstly, I hope that everyone is staying safe and is doing well in the current environment. The webinar today will be given by Shari Aaron, who's Senior Vice President here at Radius Illumination, and by Josh Liu of Global Consumer Insights Auto Care at Energizer Holdings. The webinar is scheduled, as always, to last about 45 minutes. Josh and Shari will speak for about the first 30 of those, so there should be some time for some Q&A at the end. And if you have a question for Josh or Shari as we go through, please type it into the software on the screen, and I'll be checking those as we go, and we'll save up the questions for the end. And so by way of introduction for today's webinar, you'll hear Shari and Josh discussing both internal audiences, so you can think of those as your stakeholders, and external audiences, so prospects and customers, and among other topics that we'll be thinking about with both of those audiences in mind, why segmentation should be treated programmatically. You'll also learn how to create demand before and during the process, and what are some best practices in planning a segmentation program. And finally, with Shari and Josh, we'll touch on some ideas around organizational activation against the segmentation insights that you uncover. To introduce our presenters, Shari has over 25 years of industry experience and is a well-regarded speaker, lecturer, mentor, and advisor. Shari's passionate about sustainability, health, and wellness, and is the co-author of the book Climb the Green Ladder, which is published by Wiley. Josh is an expert in inspiring organizations to think differently and to take action based upon that thinking. In addition to segmentation, Josh has demonstrated expertise in consumer empathy, marketplace assessment, cross-functional collaboration, innovation, brand building, campaign development, shopper marketing, and customer development. And one thing about Josh is he is interested in automotive in his professional and private life. And you can see here a car that Josh was telling me about earlier. This is his 1992 Mazda Miata, which he love to work on. In addition to automotive, Josh has worked in food and beverage, home, and personal care. And finally, folks, probably like you, we are hunkered down in our houses or our home offices, and as such, please excuse any background noises from noisy children or noisy spouses or dogs or whatever it might be. We'll try and keep that background noise to a minimum, obviously. And with that, over to you, Shari.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Hey, Josh. Hey, everybody in the Insights community. Really excited to be here today.
Hey, Shari. It's great to see you. It's great to be here with you, too.
So as we get started, today, Josh and I are here to share best practices that we've refined through our many years of experience with segmentation studies. So our experience spans across a lot of different categories, and it's taught us that regardless of your industry or your audience, that there are multiple layers to really consider when you lead your segmentation work. So to set the stage for today, Josh and I are going to talk about how much we value segmentation as a tool to drive cohesion and clarity in a company. It's one of those few tools that really touches upon so many different audiences, both in your organization and with your agency partners. So Josh, can you talk a little bit about how segmentation contributes to positive business outcomes?
Yeah, of course. So to me, segmentation really sets that foundation for a lot of the strategic areas that drive brand growth and sales. So you'll see on this slide, it affects or helps affect positioning, communication, engagement, and purchase decisions. It helps drive efficient and effective targeting activity. And then, of course, it helps drive innovation development. And all of that together really helps us uncover those new business opportunities, but also capitalize on the existing ones.
Fantastic. So As Josh and I are going to elaborate on, you're going to see how segmentation plays a role in all areas to help drive growth, right? It's not just a study that you should think about doing segmentation study, but really this live and evolving journey. So Josh and I are going to talk about our almost 3-year journey that we've been on together for his brands. There's a lot of important components that contribute to successful outcomes. And so these are big, time-consuming studies, and we want to make sure you're really getting it right. So we're here today to help give you some of our tips and tools and strategies. So one of the first things that we want to do is help you understand what we call the 6 principles to help you be set up for success with segmentation studies. And these are what we're going to be covering today. So first and foremost, it's about hearing the signals so that you know the time is right for when a segmentation study is needed. The next thing is about company culture. We know that company culture plays a critical role, and you have to respect the company culture in order to be successful in segmentation studies. You also need to build demand inside your organization and with your agency partners, and so we'll get into that today. We're also going to help you understand the holisticness of a segmentation study. That is, understanding the whole pie before you break it up into your consumer audience, those segments. A lot of times, people don't go after the entire addressable audience. So we want to help you so that you don't define your audience too small or too large, too wide, where you might be leaving opportunity on the table. We're also going to talk about this idea of merging the left and right brains of segmentation. So the left analytical brain with the right creative brain. These help you build data-driven segments, but then they add the color to bring it to life. And finally, and most importantly, we're going to help you understand how you activate for success. So we're going to share with you some tips and tools and things that we do for creative ways to socialize and embed the learning. So you want to engage your team in the big reveal, and we're going to help you with ways that you can create a lasting imprint that will lead very much into the future. So let's talk about this first key to success. It's about hearing the signs and signals that a segmentation study is needed. So Josh, do you want to share your thoughts around this?
Yeah, of course. So all of us on the webinar have made a career, right, out of listening and watching the world around us and then really translating those observations and insights into action. And so to me, recognizing when a new or refreshed segmentation is needed really takes that same type of discipline of observation. And there are probably certain telltale signs or telltale signals of when you might need to refresh or even run a new segmentation. So one of the really big clues is when you hear your colleagues say things like, I think, when they're talking about the consumer landscape. So this implies either an opinion or really uncertainty, and that we might not have this really solid understanding of who our current and potential consumers are. Another sign is really what's on the slide here, and that's this idea of opinion versus insight. And so our job as insights professionals is really to help hone and inform our collective intuition. But to me, that's really different than opinion. So if your organization is making decisions and directing strategy based on opinions and assumptions about the consumers and not necessarily consumer or market insights, then to me, that's a clue. And then finally, a segmentation may be warranted if it's really apparent that we cannot clearly and concisely articulate who our category and brand consumers are. And this one's so important. If your segments are not so well defined that you can't describe them or you can't describe your consumers as easily as you might be able to describe your best friend, right? Like what makes them tick and what they like and don't like and how they live and their family and their home, then you might want to consider developing a new segmentation.
Perfect. So let's move on to our next principle. I'm sure a lot of people on this call have had to defend the data against some strong internal opinions, right? So let's talk about that next success factor. Good segmentations, they serve as the engine to drive growth and new thinking within a company. But great segmentations, well, they do it in a way that really helps your teams digest and actually use the information. So in the end of the day, we want to make sure that your segmentation aligns with your organization and steers it in a more refined direction. We don't want to overhaul everything. We want to build upon strategies that have worked, but we want to be able to help you understand that it's critical that you understand the process internally and the importance of keeping company culture in mind. So Josh, do you want to elaborate that a little more on some experiences you've had inside organizations with winning with company culture?
Yeah, so some organizations are insights led and really a little bit more sophisticated. And when that's the case, you get this pull for a segmentation, and that's really fortunate. But there'll be other instances, for example, when maybe there's not a really broad understanding of what exactly a segmentation is and how you use it and why you need it, but you might recognize a latent need. And in that case, you might really need to kind of push that segmentation out to the organization. And it's in that case or those specific instances that you really need to help the organization understand the value and shift the culture so that that push really becomes a pull. And when that happens, right, then this is the way that your segmentations and any kind of program for that matter really gets received and not rejected and placed on a shelf, which is actually, right, sometimes even worse than being rejected, right? So many of us have done this really excellent work and we presented it as a gift to the company and it lands on a shelf. And we really want to make sure that doesn't happen. Also, you might be in instances when, or circumstances when the brand targets may have been developed by an external agency partner. And in those cases, I found them sometimes to be almost hypothetical or incomplete or based on or biased in based on some kind of biased perspective. And you might look at them and they really seem logical and they might feel logical, but without any actual proof or concrete evidence behind them. And Sherry, you've seen, candidly, I've done this too, right? And so as a consumer and really an enthusiast of my category, I felt pretty well equipped to be able to develop my own segmentations based on my own observations and personal insight. And then, of course, we brought in Sherry and the Radius team, and the objective when we brought them in was to help size those segments and really just get a little bit more texture behind them. But it didn't quite go that way. What we discovered, and I'm sure Sherry will chime in, what we discovered is that what we thought to be really different segments, in fact, weren't, and they weren't meaningfully different from one another. And so when I say that, I'm not saying don't start with the hypothesis. In fact, that's part of the scientific method. That's really where we need to start, but don't latch onto it as the truth. Really be open to other perspectives and welcome that change.
Exactly. And so, you had these hypothetical segments and you came to us and you said, hey, could you size and help us just get more profiling on these segments? And exactly what you say, Josh, we went and ran a segmentation study built around the idea that we could bring your hypothetical segments to life, but then lo and behold, we let the data do the talking. And as it turned out, it wasn't really a one-for-one, and some of those segments kind of combined or shifted into something else. So really helpful, as Josh is saying, to start with the hypothetical, and your customers really well, and you have a sense of that. And so then we use the data and we help make sure that you're more analytical and scientific with your work. So now let's talk about this idea of building demand inside your organization, because this is so critical. As Josh said before, you don't want this great work to land on the shelf. So Josh, why don't we talk about some ways that you've been successful, some keys to success that you have in driving demand inside your organization for segmentation studies?
Right. So this is that idea again, right, of turning that push into the pull. So right, so your organization really wants more of what you're offering, and really it might be a bit of a cliche, but to me the most critical critical key to success in the segmentation is to take those stakeholders with you through that entire journey, and this way you'll be getting that buy-in as you go through the entire process. So from the qualitative work up front, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, to defining and addressing, to defining that entire addressable market, aligning on the details of the questionnaire, right? What are the attributes and behaviors that you really want to make sure are reflected in the segmentation? And then all the way at the end, which we'll talk about the activation, that point about really naming the segments in a way that we embed them. And so that idea of creating the shared ownership not only helps better inform the work, but right by bringing that entire array of perspectives, but it really also helps generate excitement and anticipation and accountability, right? And really the convenient byproduct of all that is along the way you've created this team of advocates, and so you'll really start driving that demand. You know, in my experience, a few tips that have worked pretty well for me to establish that. So one is really educate on the process, the steps, and the timing right from the beginning, and rely on your agency partners to help do that. Right, they've got a lot more experience in this than you may have. Listen to and embrace all those different voices, right? Every opinion and every voice is valid at this stage. You want to really make sure that you're influencing the influencers, right? Remember you want those evangelists, the people who are listened to throughout the organization, to be your advocates. The fourth point I'd say is really, understand and embrace the idea of continuous loop, continuous feedback. So refine as you go and just keep making it better and better, right? Better is better. And then finally, that very last point is reflecting back on the idea of opinions. Embrace those opinions and really pressure test them and see what works and what doesn't, and be open to change.
That is really valuable advice. Thank you. Let's talk about another important component now. We know this phrase, know the consumer, right? It's a phrase we as insights professional, we live by it. Here, what we're talking about is making sure that you really understand the whole picture, the whole pie of the audience, before you start to break them up into meaningful segments or pieces. So we need to see the world from the lens of the consumer. We know that some insights professionals just see segmentation as a quantitative study with advanced analytic techniques that create the segments. Yet we, Josh and I, know the power of qualitative research and ethnography to bring your audiences to life. Josh and I started doing ethnographies to understand category users in his category before we started diving into segmentation. So we spent a lot of time together in people's driveways and in their garages, really watching their stories, listening to their stories. So Josh, I know you're a big fan of qualitative as it plays a role in segmentation. Could you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Sure, yeah, so Sherry, you've probably heard me say the quote, and it's one of my favorite quotes, right? It's by Yogi Berra, and it's, you could observe a lot just by watching. Right, and so to me, that means that there's really no real substitute for getting out there and meeting your consumers. And not just the consumers that you already know, right, because that's just navel gazing, but rather you really want to make sure that you cast that net wide enough and discover where the further opportunities, lie, right? Like meet those people who may not be using your brand, may not even be using your category directly, but might still be an opportunity, right? So again, right, that quote. You can observe a lot just by watching. So to me, the best qualitative work is the work that gets us out of that autopilot mode, right? And just kind of assuming what we know to be true and puts us in that mode of really watching, and probably even more important than watching, noticing what our consumers are doing, those little nuances of their behavior, how they make the decisions, and to your point that you just mentioned, the stories, right? And it's those details and it's those stories that make the difference between what's probably a pretty good segmentation and what would be a really excellent segmentation that you could learn and that you could grow from. Yeah, so just a little bit of an example of this, and I'll introduce you to some of the consumers that we've met along the way. And you'll start to understand, I think, how important it is to really understand each of these people in a qualitative way before you get to the quantitative aspect of the segmentation. So all the way on the left here, we have Ken, and you can see here, he's a car guy, right? And he takes care of his car just because because it's just the right thing to do. You can see a little bit in the picture, he's got this pickup truck, and it's not a fancy truck or anything like that, but it's just impeccably maintained. He does it because it's the right thing to do. And so in those conversations, with Ken in his driveway, we said, hey, do you mind opening your garage? We're kind of curious to see what are some of the different products you use, and maybe if you give us a little bit of a tour. And he opens that garage that you see behind him, and right there is this gorgeous black BMW, and the license plate is Clams, right? And we've been talking about his pickup truck the whole time, but of course that piqued our interest a little bit. And he went on to tell us about how this was the car that he and his dad used to take on fishing trips all the time. It was kind of their bonding thing. And so what we recognized was, it's not just about because it's the right thing to do, but he really has this really strong emotional connection with this car, and that affects the decisions he makes. That wouldn't have come across if we just went straight to the quantitative survey piece of the segmentation. Next to him, we have Ryan, and we've got him labeled as an organized car guy. Now he works in the education system. Before the pandemic, his life, I'm sure, was a little bit different, but on the weekends, his Mazda SUV, and that was the family car, right? And so it did all the family car stuff, but during the week, the role shifted, and that family car became his office. He lived and worked and basically spent the entire day in that car. And so his real motivation for taking care of it the way he did was to kind of establish this sense of order and control. But what was really interesting about him, and this is that concept of casting the wider net, is when we asked him to kind of go and get the products and that he would use to take care of his car and go through the process, and we went through the basic stuff. He didn't go and get anything or any of the products that are in the category that we were there to understand. Instead, he went into his closet and he grabbed the vacuum cleaner, and then he went under his kitchen sink and he grabbed some glass cleaner and he grabbed some multi-purpose cleaner, none of which were made specifically for his car, but that was the stuff he was using, right? And so just watching that set this little light bulb off, and it really helped us redefine who we really compete with, right? Like, not our closest competitors, and maybe not even our category, but it helped us understand behaviorally what our competition set was. Sarah, remember that one?
I do, and I actually remember that you were saying that in your secondary data sources, you kept seeing Windex come up, and you kept thinking that it was just a mistake. Why is Windex in there? It's not a car category cleaning product, right? But lo and behold, we were in Ryan's driveway. He's doing the whole inside of his car, not just his windows with Windex. Boy, were you cringing, but we really did learn and see how your products are used. And then we also opened up to really understand that multi-purpose products are something that you compete with.
Exactly, right. So then next to Ryan, we have Crystal. And when we met Crystal, she was a new mom. She had just gone back to work full time. Her son TJ was at daycare during the day, and so she had this new mom hectic life. And she wasn't a car person at all, but her life, and as she described it, was exhausting even just to listen to, right? So she'd wake up, she'd get herself ready and everybody ready and TJ ready, and throw TJ in the car, and they'd go off and drop at daycare. Then she would drive an hour to her job, and she'd work for the day, and then she'd have an hour commute back. And what she would describe to us was that when she got in her car at the end of the day and sat down, she had this kind of this ah moment, right? This ah feeling. And her car wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It actually almost served as an escape pod for her. And so her motivation, and the reason she took care of her car primarily the way she did, was so that she had that almost serenity when she got inside of her car at the end of the day. And it was really important to her on this emotional, much more emotional than functional reason. And then as a little side thing, and as we're talking to her, we learned this, is that there's this little bit of judgment in there too. And so on top of that escape pod, she kind of started telling us about in this small way that she felt a little bit judged, whether it was by her family or other moms, and she considered her entire appearance, including the condition of her vehicle, as a reflection of her and the way she takes care of her family. So really different, much deeper motivation than maybe just keeping your car clean for the sake of it. And then of course we have Mark all the way on the right. So Mark is a plumber. He works for the municipality in which he lives, and he's this just quintessential family guy. And we kind of tried to understand, his attitudes and behaviors, and not necessarily the products he used, but just kind of what makes him tick we really learned that his mantra was almost that if you want to do something right, you've got to do it. You've got to do it yourself. And he didn't develop this kind of value system by himself. He inherited it, and he inherited it from his dad. And one of the most important aspects of his life was that not just has he inherited and does he live this way, but it was really important for him to pass that on to his son. And so while we were there just to talk to Mark and understand him, his son was right there with him. His son was his shotgun rider, and he was sitting next to him in the seat, and he was taking care of his car right there besides his dad. And such a different perspective and such a different story than Crystal or Ryan or Ken. And so what this all kind of tells us together is that if we're demonstrators, just to say, is this kind of breadth of consumers. And if you really cast that net wide enough, you could use the qual work to understand all those differences and really get all that texture that you might not otherwise see. Sharon?
Yeah, you know, Josh, it's incredible. You can pull these people up and communicate them so clearly 3 years later. And I know how much we've helped bring them to life inside the organization as well. Sorry, I hope I didn't cut you off from that last one. Apologies.
No, that was.
Okay, so we've now talked about this idea that you've heard the signals, right? That's one of our success factors. Another one is building the demand, aligning with the company culture, and we've gathered this holistic view of the consumer audience. So what we want to focus on now is building the right segments. We want to ensure that the segmentation merges that left brain and the right brain together. We absolutely need that robust analytical technique and rigor to ensure that we let the data do the talking. At Radius, we call it the big bake-off, right? We run a variety of different segmentation techniques, and we come up with the best segmentation. We don't have any assumptions going in, and everything is on the table because we want to let the data do the talking for us. But then we rely on our creativity and our art to bring these segments to life in a way that's going to make sense for Josh's internal stakeholders who have to use them. So Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about that art and science for the optimal segmentation?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, it's probably just kind of echoing a little bit. To me, that idea of left brain and right brain or art and science, it's not a handoff, right? It's not that we kind of do one piece and we do all the qualitative that we just spoke about and then hand it off. But rather, it's these two systems kind of operate continuously, and one informs the other in a constant way. And so, right, so the analysis, right, the data act as this kind of, you know, when you get it back, the analysis and the data act as almost like a starting point for the segmentation, but really a starting point of what the segmentation could look like. And from there, to your point earlier, Sherry, we kind of iterate, and in turn, we bring in some of the texture from the qual, and right, so each phase is the circle kind of going back and forth and back and forth, and as we iterate together, right, we aim for this goal of ultimately arriving at this kind of collection of segments that are manageable enough to internalize and that are differentiated enough that they can influence our strategy, and then of course large enough that there's the opportunity. And so really this concept of blending the advanced analytics and those really collaborative discussions, I think has resulted in much more powerful segmentations than otherwise would have happened.
Yeah, and to follow up with that point, you know, what does a winning segmentation look like? So as Josh was alluding to, it's this idea that we want them to be meaningful to people and intuitive. So when we say Ken, or now when we say Ryan, it's going to be intuitive. We want them to be clearly differentiated in terms of needs, attitudes, and behaviors, right? People are likely to respond differently to different products or services, and you need to be able to anticipate that, what this means for your brand, construct your portfolio in a way to meet the needs of the different behaviors and needs. We also want to make sure that we're measurable in terms of size and revenue potential. We spend a lot of time looking at those different segmentation solutions because we also really want to make sure that we're getting to the right way that you can understand the size, the potential, the priority of these segments. And lastly, the test of a winning segmentation is that your segmentation solution, each of the segments, really is accessible, or what we call targetable, so that you can reach them through either standard go-to-market approaches, like demographics, or maybe with your media agency, or maybe there's third-party databases that you're using, because there's no point in creating a segmentation scheme or segments that you're not going to be able to reach. So as we start to wind down today, we want to touch upon that last key to success, which is the activation portion. So Josh, how about you share some tips and tricks for powerful activation?
Sure. So so this is the last part that we're talking about today, and it's the last step in that process. But just because it's the last step, it should not at all imply that it's least important. In fact, you could argue that it's at least equally, if not more important than all the rest of it, right? So don't consider it an afterthought, and don't wait until the end to start planning for it, right? So plan early on for what your activation might look like. Right, this is how you'll deliver on that demand that you've been building through the entire process. It brings to mind another Yogi Berra quote, another one of my favorites, right? So if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. So really think of that activation as your endpoint in this process. Probably most importantly, what I would say is while these segments were defined by data, don't forget that they represent the actual people. Ken and Ryan and Mark and Crystal, right? These are actual people who might buy and hopefully will buy and consume your brand. So don't lose sight of that, right? The goal of the activation is to help bring those people to life. And in that sense, the names and those personifications of the segment really, really matter. Don't skimp on that. Think again about the people that we've just described, their stories, right? And so here's just a few ways, or just some approaches that I've seen in the past that have been pretty successful in helping get that data off of the page and then imprinting those segments onto into the organization. So posters, right? This is we've seen this a lot, and it's really valuable. But not only just the posters, but think about what's on them and where you might put them throughout the building for when we all end up back in buildings again, right? So places like elevators where you have that captive audience, and think outside of where just the marketing and insights colleagues sit. Make sure that the whole organization has the opportunity to really be introduced and get to know the different segments. There's things like desk drops and cards, but you can even go beyond the basics and have these really beautiful printed booklets or magazines, and they cost money, but they become really valuable references. And they sit there right on the desk with everybody that needs them. It's a really nice way to make sure that your consumers and your targets are available and accessible to everybody who needs them whenever they need to see them. Another really, really interesting approach that could work and that has worked is think of it as think of these segments and the profiles of segments as almost the way you might write your dating app or your Bumble profile, right? So what's the most important thing that you'd want a potential partner to know about you, right? And if you kind of draft these not necessarily as charts with circles and arrows and percentages, again that matters, but what's the important stuff, right? That'll really help bring that segment off of the page and to life. And then finally, and Sherry will remember this, one of the really interesting and quite frankly very fun ways to bring the segmentations off of the page and to life is to have your entire team, and even outside of your team, throughout your company, go through that typing tool, right? It's kind of fun to think about who you might think you might, or who you think you might be, and go through that battery of questions yourself and the entire team and see, well, does that kind of match what you thought, and how does it not, and how does it or doesn't it? And the consequence of that is that you've now really engaged them in the process, and they get to know themselves as consumers, but also what the entire landscape might look like. That was a lot of fun when we did that.
Exactly. So I remember we had our whole team do it as well, and I mapped to being a prideful delegator, which I take a lot of pride in to this day. But yeah, the typing tool also, as Josh is saying, is great to get your team members, agency partners, stakeholders on board. but it's also something that you could then live forward. So, we have it in tracking studies or other pieces of research. So you're constantly learning about these segments for knowledge and ways to continue the learning forward. I think the idea of doing socialization events is another thing we can talk about. And really, like, however you choose to do the activation part, our advice today is really don't skimp on this. It's critical to use these creative approaches, whether you go with, booklets and typing tools, or you do a socialization event. Some things that we do to really build that imprint is creative events like the Great American Race, or another time we rented an Airbnb and we took all the different rooms and made them different segments, even down to like a bed that was unmade and maybe had some spilt soda on the floor to represent that segment. And we had people go into each of those rooms and really, again, do activities and exercises to imprint the learning and to take away the ethos or the ethos of who that segment is. And we have lots of ways and techniques that we can also do this in an online world where we could really bring them to life. And a lot of those things that we've had to pivot to because we're now remote, they're actually improvements to what we would want to do that we may keep going forward. So lots of really fun ways that you can bring them to life, but all that matters is you want to make sure that people use them, understand them, imprint, and keep going forward. So I think that's all we are planning to talk to today, although we want to open this up. Happy to take your questions either now as we have time together, or you can feel free to email us and we'll get back to you about questions. So why don't I turn this over to Paul now for us to take some of the questions that may have come in.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Josh. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is around sort of length of time and planning process. About how long would you plan for segmentation work? About how long does it take, and how should I think about the planning process time?
That's a great question. I'm happy to take that one. So it's not something that you can move through in a very short, 2 or 3 week period. On the other hand, it doesn't have to take months and months and months. So it's really about working together with your client partner to understand the implications of the timing. You want to be able to plan for a qualitative phase unless you have a lot of those insights already, so you can take that big picture view. And while that qualitative research is happening, the quantitative pieces can be lined up, so you're sort of running things almost in parallel, but you take the learnings from the qualitative into the quantitative. And then we go into a workshop where we fast track the learning, we look at different segmentation solutions together, we play them out. So what we try and do is maybe in a 8 or 10 week period, give you something that could go from soup to nuts and really get you up and running. So this does tend to be a little bit longer of a process, but working together with your partner, you can work through the phases pretty quickly.
Sherry, I'd probably even just add to that, there's always urgency, right? Everything needs, is fast-paced and needs to happen quickly. But I would urge you, to the extent that you can, to kind of push back as it relates to a process like a segmentation, right? Because this is like a really foundational, really important piece of work, and it's not, right? The objective isn't to answer a question that's happened right now. It's to be this foundational piece of work that you're going to live with for a while. And so that urge to maybe try to accelerate as much as you can might come at the expense of not to say that it wouldn't be excellent, but might come at the expense of value. And you really don't want to make that kind of trade-off if you're going to use this foundational segmentation for years forward.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And then the pre-planning, whatever you can do to sort of get yourself set up for success and plan so that when you are ready to kick off, you can, at least team members can feel like there's momentum happening.
We have another question here. We've got a few questions. I'll go with this first one over here. So this company has an existing segmentation. People have been using it for about 5 years. They still use it. It gives utility to the organization. How do they know it's time to redo that sort of internally much loved segmentation.
Josh, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think you'll probably find the same answer for a lot of things, but it depends, right? So I think probably one of those clues that might be time to either refresh or do something new. There's some really big significant change in the marketplace or in consumer base.
Sure. I don't know if that sounds okay to you, Sherry. That sort of broke up for me.
Yeah, Josh, you broke up a little bit. I'm happy to jump in. I think the idea is that there's a couple of reasons that you might want to think about redoing that segmentation study, which is that the market has changed. So I think Josh may be talking about this idea that, there's enough changes in the market where 5 years ago to today, you could potentially say COVID might be one of those times. It really depends upon your category. Either that or you've seen major disruptors in your category that really change the category. So somebody new that wasn't there before, like let's say Ring doorbell or Amazon coming out, although that's dating things. But the idea is that there's a disruptor that's happening that's changing the way you might go to market and might be changing how you want to look at your consumers. So I think there's some signs to be able to tell. Essentially what you can do is if you really feel like the segmentation study needs to be updated, is you can build upon that previous learning. Remember, we said don't necessarily throw it out and field a new segmentation study, and then you'll have a judge of which one of those segments might still hold. Has the size of the different segments shifted? So there's a way to build upon your previous segmentation study, but also feel more relevant to the market today.
Yeah, I'd say, hopefully you could hear me now a little bit better. So, yeah, so I'd say you should probably kind of look at it two different ways, right? There's has the marketplace change in terms of sizing, right? In which case, if you still feel confident in the inputs to your segmentation, the typing tool in the first place, then you could simply just rerun the typing tool, right? And then just get those different sizes and weights. And that's relatively simple. And if you think rather that there's been some really significant changes in the marketplace and the landscape, then you could do some testing and see, hey, do we really need to redo it? But it doesn't, right? So I think there's some kind of qualitative feel of, well, what exactly needs to change? And is it a refresh, a resize, or a start all over?
Good advice.
And I don't know if we use party or behavioral data in your segmentation, Josh, but there is a question around, is there an opportunity to do that? I think from our perspective, there is always the opportunity to look for internal or even external third-party data to look to see where it can add some addition to the attitudinal data that we would collect mostly for an attitudinal-based segmentation. But any sort of comments on your experience with that, Josh, if you have taken care of that in the past? I'm not sure, or how you've thought about that.
Yeah, so this might be answering the question a little bit the other way around, but what we have done is we've taken the typing tool that's come out of the segmentation and built it into the syndicated panel data that we have. So when we're looking for opportunities in POS data, for example, we're able to look at that by segment, which is a really nice, right, a really nice approach versus just looking at the collective marketplace.
It's a creative answer. Folks, I think that's all the questions that I can see there. There were a few questions around, will we be sharing an audio and video of this? Yes, we will, folks, for everybody who joined. Thank you, everybody. I have 12:44 my time. Appreciate everybody attending. Josh, Shari, thank you. Our next webinar will be in a couple of months, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Shari.
Thanks so much, Josh. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Bye.